What Trump has done is expose the fact that we're at the end of constitutional rule in the United States. What happens when there's a thuggish rule remains to be seen, but in my view, this makes the world extraordinarily dangerous. Of course, we're hardly at the end of the story about Venezuela itself. They have arrested a president. But this is not the end of anything. The whole history of U.S. regime change operations, which number probably around 100 such operations since the end of World War II, is a record of bloodshed, violence, deliberate creation of instability, coups, assassinations, civil war. So we don't know what will come next. This isn't just about Venezuela. It's about what happens when power stops respecting limits. Once constitutional restraint eritis at home, international law becomes optional abroad. The U.S. has a long history of regime change and it's never brought stability, only chaos. Venezuela now enters that same dangerous pattern where outcomes stop being predictable and violence fills the vacuum. The U.S. has been trying to overthrow the government of Venezuela for 23 years. They tried to coup against the predecessor of Maduro, Hugo Chavez. They have announced that the U.S. is the enemy that Venezuela is the enemy of the United States, to put it more clearly, because this has been a left-wing regime that believes that Venezuela's resources belong to Venezuela and that Venezuela does not have to follow the U.S. dictates on who controls the oil and who receives the rents and so on. And so this is a long story and it's very important to understand. In 2017, in Trump's first year of office, he said to a dinner table of Latin American leaders, "Why don't I just invade Venezuela?" Two of the leaders talked him down from that. I heard from two presidents that were there independently about this dinner. That idea of Trump of invading Venezuela is 8 years in the making. The lead, a cheerleader of invading Venezuela, was Senator Marco Rubio, and now a Secretary of State Marco Rubio. And there were celebrations in Florida today of Venezuelan expats and others celebrating the U.S. action. This didn't start now. For over 20 years, the U.S. has tried to overthrow Venezuela's government, not over democracy, but over control of oil. Donald Trump even floated invasion years ago, pushed by figures like Marco Rubio. What's happening today is the outcome of a long-planned strategy. What does this mean? This is partly U.S. politics because Florida is a swing state, but it means it's been a long-term project. Whatever is said is just blah blah blah. This is a concerted long-term attempt to bring down the government of Venezuela. I think people would do well to understand how the U.S. foreign policy operates. It operates on a long-term basis and tells whatever lies or stories or narratives it wants to tell at any given moment to keep the long-term narrative. In the case of Ukraine, it was a 30-year project to bring Ukraine into the American military orbit. This goes back to the early 1990s. In the case of Venezuela, it's been a more than 20-year effort. In the case of Syria, where Bashar al-Assad was brought down last year, that was an effort of 13 years by the CIA and the U.S. deep state. These are projects in trying to overthrow Venezuela, which just happens to have the world's largest reserves of oil in the whole world, larger than Saudi Arabia, though more expensive to produce because it's heavy oil, but still the world's largest reserves. Well, this is a project of the United States. Trump is unusually thuggish. The collapse of the American constitutional order is very far advanced. I would say if you think about Roman history going from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire, which is usually dated to 27 BC with Augustus becoming the princeps, I would say we're somewhere into the reign of Tiberius now. In other words, the U.S. stopping a constitutional order. This is how U.S. foreign policy actually works. Long projects, short excuses. Ukraine took 30 years. Venezuela over 20, Syria more than a decade. The narratives change, but the objective stays the same. Control strategic regions and resources. What's different now is the tone. Under Donald Trump, restraint is gone and constitutional limits are visibly eroding. That's what makes this moment dangerous. What will determine the verdict is what happens in the coming days and weeks and months. My guess on that, and I will underscore guess, is that nothing will go smoothly. We have a long history of regime change operations. Sometimes they succeed. This one has not even succeeded yet. This has been a decapitation of a president and his wife, not of the regime, and it's hard actually to see how the regime is brought down by this piracy, but it's possible that something more happens. I'm sure there are plans and ideas, but the history of these operations is that they are followed by long periods of unrest, coups, instability, insurrections, civil war. History tells us what comes next. Regime change operations rarely end cleanly. Even when they succeed, they're followed by chaos, unrest, coups, and civil war. This wasn't the fall of a system, only the removal of a figure. What happens next is almost never controlled. 10, 20, 30 years ago, but we have the trappings of the Senate the same way that the Romans kept the trappings of the Senate. We don't have a constitutional order. We have a president enriching himself. And his friends. Nobody says a word. We have a president that rules by executive decree. No one says a word. We have a president going to war against Iran or complicity in Gaza or attacking Venezuela or bombing Nigeria. Nobody says a word. We're into a post-constitutional order in the United States. So this is really our situation. It's quite dramatic. The world should not sit by if it takes any lessons from history. This is an extraordinarily dangerous period. The reason we created international law, the International Court of Justice, it was not for the U.S. to sanction it and threaten it and bludgeon it. It was to avoid global annihilation in a third world war, but that one in the nuclear age. We're getting closer to that every moment when we rip up the UN Charter. This is the warning. The forms of democracy still exist, but the limits don't. Power now operates by decree, not restraint. History shows where this leads. When constitutional order collapses, international law follows, and in a nuclear world that makes this period extraordinarily dangerous, and I think that this is quite possible what will happen in Venezuela. There's a very good book that everyone who wants to understand American foreign policy should read called A Covert Regime Change by Lynn Seur, who was a PhD student of John Mearsheimer, and wrote her dissertation on the 64 covert regime change operations that took place between 1947 and 1989. By the way, covert regime change is a little bit of an oxymoron. When the regime is changed, you know who did it. What covert means is the U.S. lies about it. So, not that it's unknown who did it, but that the U.S. lies about it. So, you could say 64 regime change operations in which the U.S. lied. Now, she documents what happens. Many of them failed to achieve regime change. Maybe they assassinated a leader but didn't change the regime. Many changed the regime. But of those that changed the regime, most descended into prolonged instability. There are very few cases where the U.S. political purpose was served by what happened. Even if you don't accept the U.S. political purpose as legitimate, just to ask the question, did the U.S. achieve its aims? The answer is very, very rarely, and I think in the case of Venezuela it would be a real long shot that the U.S. achieves its aims and I don't accept the aims, but even if one accepted the aims of regime change, the idea that this will lead to a pro-U.S. democracy in which Chevron and ExxonMobil will thrive. Well, that's Trump's aim, but I think it's unlikely to be realized. History is clear. As Lynn Seur documents, most U.S. regime change operations either fail outright or produce long-term instability. Even when leaders are removed, the system rarely changes. Venezuela is unlikely to be different. And the idea that this ends in a stable pro-U.S. democracy serving companies like Chevron or ExxonMobil is a long shot. The Chinese and the Russians especially have sent out very strong condemnation. But do you see this moving in a dangerous direction? Well, it certainly moves in a dangerous direction. Anytime there is a violent attack by the United States against another country, it can have many profound ricochet effects. So this is of course dangerous. I don't think that Russia or China, as you rightly said, will directly intervene or challenge the United States on this militarily. Though I think that they will strongly condemn this from the point of view of the UN Charter. If we see this followed up by violence inside Venezuela and an attack by Israel in Iran, well then we're really heading towards a potential complete explosion and disaster. Iran, of course, would be far more dangerous and destabilizing than this attack on Venezuela, which is bad enough. But if Israel now takes this, and I think they're very likely to, as the cue for an attack on Iran, I think we're heading towards all kinds of very, very dire and unpredictable consequences. Iran itself is no pushover, and Venezuela may prove to be no pushover, but Iran far stronger and able to inflict far more damage, and with friends that can inflict even far more damage. So it's extremely dangerous. This kind of thuggery has a contagion effect. This is how escalation begins. One illegal strike creates permission for the next. China and Russia may not respond militarily, but the norms are breaking. If this spills into Iran, the consequences won't be contained. Thuggery spreads, and history shows it rarely stops where it starts. I think the main point is one should not glibly say, well, the US is doing in Venezuela what Putin did in Ukraine. It's actually the US is doing in Venezuela what the US did in Ukraine. So this is both US provoked. These are both projects of the US. And I hope people can come to understand how US foreign policy works and what a military-industrial state really means. What a military-industrial complex without a constitutional bounds means, what the CIA means in such operations. If they did, they would understand that when we view Ukraine and Venezuela, we're viewing the same phenomenon as long-term projects of the would-be global hegemon carried out in different ways. Now, I think Trump maybe has the idea that the Americas are ours. The Middle East is ours. Africa, we don't want Ukraine. Well, that's Russia's. That's not even how Russia views